We are in for a treat, as always, this afternoon. Technology with empathy. So many articles, so many comments around where technology is taking us. Over during 2020, we had an immersion in more tech than most of us ever thought we would be living through, working from home, etc. So we're going to have a conversation today with two amazing people who are doing much work in this space. Chris Zalarsky, designer and game theorist. I don't think I've ever had a designer and game theorist on the salons before. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much,
And Jean Leggett, CEO of One More Story Games, leadership coach for creatives. I love that, leadership coach for creatives. Welcome, Jean.
Thanks very much for having me.
So let's just, before we actually get into some of the discussion that we did have prior to the salon going live, I would love to find out something about each of you that I cannot find online, that I wouldn't find on your LinkedIn profiles or your Facebook pages or anything like that. So Jean, I'm going to throw to you first. What insights can you give us into you?
Oh, that's tough. My life is an open book. I have like podcasts and talks and everything. Gosh, golly, that is like a really tough question. I think this isn't something that you cannot find out online, but it is a fun thing about me. When I was a kid, I wish that I knew that I could have made games professionally, or at least played them professionally, because I would have been a champion, world-class Tetris player.
Whoa.
But I didn't know that you could even do that competitively. So that would have been, that's a little something about me.
Love it. Thank you so much. And Chris, you've had a couple of seconds to think about it. What's yours?
Yeah, well, thank you for that heads up. For me, I suppose I would like to maybe mention that even though my specialization is game design, it's not my life, playing games especially. And so I enjoy snowboarding, swimming, sort of hiking and things like that. And traveling. And I think it's sort of part of maybe how I've come to specialize in what I do. It's sort of like investigating reality and the aesthetics that we find in the everyday, and how that influences sort of the creative process. So I think it's sort of not your typical nerd, you could say, sort of in that way.
I find it actually fascinating how what has started off as the gaming industry, the online gaming, augmented reality, virtual reality gaming industry has spilled over into the workplace and into our lives, but I'm sure we'll get into that as we go. So let's begin. Have you noticeably seen a decline in humanity and empathy? So maybe not a decline in humanity, but a decline in empathy towards humanity, as there has been an increase in the use of technology? What are your thoughts on that?
Chris, I'm going to let you answer that one first.
Sure, it's a huge question, but I mean, there's in general, I mean, there's just been this shift towards sort of right-wing politics around the world, and it's sort of hard to separate sort of the technological side from sort of the political side, as that's been increasing. So you could say there's empathy's been on the decline in some way in general. But there's no doubt something that we lose when we are communicating purely through digital media, something about being in the same space, seeing the same people in their physical form, not 2D representations. And even in advance of this talk, I was thinking back to when I first started to learn to paint. Working for a video game studio in London, you're sitting at your desk, and it was this walking into the art school and smelling the paints, getting your hands dirty with the turpentine and oil paint. And, artistically, there's something very visceral about being there and being present, sort of again sort of linking back to my work, and so when we think about meeting people and connecting with them, seeing their reactions, there's definitely a major part of what makes us human lost in these interactions. I think I can bat over the question to Jean, and maybe sort of respond to something you say on this topic.
You know, it's interesting because as somebody who's like, I'm coming up into my mid 40s, I've been playing in online game spaces since the mid 90s. And I think the moment that we got cell phones, something really changed in a lot of us. And I think deeply about this whole idea of the accessibility and the proliferation of technology, and what does that mean for us as humans. And I'm going to say that I don't see a decline in empathy, but I see a decline in promoting empathic role models. And I see that the clickbait, like we're using technology to drive clickbait and commerce, and we're not doing so with ethical foundations. And so that has become the focus, is just like money, 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 profit, profit, profit. And then we're starting to see more hate clicks. And that is what is driving our attention economy. So I think really we've become more connected, and the opportunities for to have meaningful conversations with people around the world, no matter if you're in communities for specialized needs or specialized interests, we have deeper empathy, and we're starting to understand what other people's experiences are like. But the underlying mechanism is, in my opinion, diseased. And I think that's where we're in danger of being disconnected from each other and losing our sense of empathy. If they're trying to monetize our misery and monetize our fear, that's where we're disconnecting from each other. I don't think it's the technology piece. I think it's the people who are controlling our access to information.
I actually love that you said that, because we very often say it's not the technology that is the issue, it's the human behind the technology. And I think also, I tend to agree with you. I actually believe that there's a rise in empathy and a rise in hate clicks at the same time. And for me, it's almost like we're at this point of evolution where we really need to choose. You know, do we want to live in love, or do we want to live in fear and hate?
Yeah.
Chris, do you have a response to what Jean said?
No, it is much better stated. I think so. I agree fully there. I think it's more that my approach is, again, as I'll sort of maybe explain later on, more on exploring the mechanisms of how we can use technology to sort of physically connect to people. And but I agree, of course, for sure. It's definitely, you know, I was even thinking of Ricky Gervais being a figurehead for, is it the Golden Globes, you know, where ridicule has become the clickbait, you know, sort of having him ridicule the actors, and sort of that's a telltale sign of sort of what Gina's mentioning as well, for sure.
I think it's very interesting that you mention the physicality of the creative process as well. We just came off the back of the summit. We had the Tesla suit, which is a haptic suit, so you can feel what's going on. And it was in a gaming situation. So Tesla have in association with a gentleman by the name of Daniel Kelly, released a game called Flynn's Arcade. And it's this disc throwing thing that hits you and hurts you. But we were thinking and discussing also about the positive aspects of how you could use this haptic suit in the age of digital technology to give somebody, like you two could actually hug each other if you had a Tesla haptic suit on right now, and you would feel what that embrace was like. So I'm so much in agreement with you. You walk into, I used to run an art department for a tertiary institution. I'd walk in and smell the clay and smell the paint, and it was a totally different aesthetic experience. Can you maybe delve more into how those senses heighten empathy, particularly in both your work? So how does that sensory feel, that sensory acknowledgement heighten what you both do? So Jean, I might throw to you first.
Sure. You know, I think back to a project that we've had in the works for the last couple of years. It has been on pause, and I would very much like to see revived. And it's an adaptation of a novel surrounding the story of a woman who's experienced sexual assault and post-traumatic stress disorder. And when, as a narrative designer, I go in and I start thinking about all of the layers and nuances and the subtext, and really being very mindful about how we express the narrative piece. When I think about technology and I think about what would that be like to be able to have that physical response as you're playing that, how could we use that for good? Right. And I think the reason I stay in games, the reason games is a very interesting space to be in, because I see it as the foundational piece of how interactive digital media is the future of storytelling, in my opinion. Right? We're never going to lose our love for stories, but we need to be very mindful of how we tell the stories and the foundational ethical pieces that we build in for design. Imagine somebody being able to have a mindfully designed experience that you can understand and deeply empathize with somebody who has gone through trauma. We already see games that are being created that are the perception of, for example, Japanese internment camps or Holocaust survivors. We see that virtual reality is being used to connect elderly people who are going through dementia or other cognitive decline. And all of these pieces we're using for good. There should be more of that. We should be mindful more towards that. So I think there's really powerful stuff. And I hope that as we're having this discussion, that we can do something to put in place the safeguards so that people aren't using this for nefarious purposes.
Thanks. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So, I mean, this gives me an opportunity to maybe expand on that, my sort of personal perspective on empathy that I sort of started off earlier, because my approach is sort of on kinesthetic empathy, especially. So it's in a way understanding how games physically move us and the aesthetic qualities of those movements. And we can say that games allow us to archive bodily experiences. So in support of what Jean said, in a way, we can, games are usually designed with an objective in mind. These are formal games, objectives in mind. There is a winning condition. You have to beat someone or something to achieve a high score or just to win. It's sort of what we see in board games, what we see in sports. But the definition of games is being stretched so much that it's sometimes hard to sort of convincingly say, is this a game or is this like a new type of game? And I have an example that if you don't mind me sharing, sort of just 2 slides that kind of take a real world example. That's something that I hope everyone can relate to. I'm just going to share my slides here. So can you see that on screen, the signature? Okay, great. So the idea is that we can begin to start to imagine designing games around empathy. So this is like empathy being the driving principle. And usually in my presentations, I ask students to make a copy of this signature. So this being the author being anonymous initially. And the idea is you can do the same as well. So everyone at home can sort of like trace these lines, and the bigger you thank you for sort of following me. So the bigger the lines, the more you can even close your eyes and feel what those gestures are like. And then I ask everyone to do this signature, sort of following these lines, and you can kind of get a feeling for how the line quality, the aesthetic quality of this lines changes your physical experience. And a signature in itself, we all have almost like as diverse as our fingerprints. Signatures are very personal to us. They can change from day to day depending on your body tension, your emotions. And this is where I can highlight that the first signature is from Kamala Harris and the second one is from Donald Trump. So by recreating those signatures, what you have done is physically embodied those figures in the very moment when they express themselves. So it was something that attracted each author to the aesthetic quality of these lines, and they recreate those every time they put their pen down on the page. So if you imagine that these lines could represent the behavior of a character in terms of in a video game, They could represent the pathways that you ask players to track through a virtual environment. This gives you an indication of how we can archive these bodily experiences. And the more dynamic these lines are embedded within the system, the more you can evoke different physical experiences, as Jean, in the sort of on very serious and very meaningful topics like the ones that Jean explores in her work, for instance.
That's
That
remarkable.
was really cool.
Jean, what were you thinking when when you were doing the first, outlining the first signature?
I was trying to figure out, I'm pretty good at handwriting analysis. I'm like, whose is that? I knew the second one was Donald. And I think that's such a cool way to talk about our body experience, how it connects to our experience of being in an immersive world. I know that one of the people that's watching our talk right now is a mutual friend of Chris and I, Juliana Lowe, and she is a tilt brush artist. And I don't know if you've ever seen somebody do tilt brush art. It is quite phenomenal. I remember the first time I saw it, I think it was 2016, 17, when tilt brush just came out. It was like Magic Brush or something like that. I could get that wrong. Magic Leap. And just watching somebody do live virtual painting, and imagine giving tools like that to small children. Like it's remarkable to me how our bodies just adapt to being in these immersive spaces and what synapses are firing in our brains. So I just find that really cool. I'm addicted to this industry.
Love to ask some of the panelists what their reactions were, whether you actually did the tracing and what your reactions were when you found out whose signatures they were, if you didn't know, sorry, some of the attendees. So if you just want to write something in the chat, that would be fantastic. So technology, empathy, how do you think it's affecting? So if we drill right down, how do you think technology is affecting our capacity for empathy? Whether that be through gaming, whether that be through examples that you just showed us as well, Chris. How do you, what is, I know you just walked us through some of the physiological reactions that might come with that, but how is the technology affecting our ability to feel empathy? Jean, I'll throw to you first again.
Wow. I feel like we are creating opportunities. All right, I'm going to just dive right into this. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in technology is the fact that it has been dominated by so long by white men. And so the more diverse creators that we have that come in and give us an opportunity to see and experience stories, but also ideas and experiences that are beyond our current limited scope, there are so many things that we haven't even discovered yet that will help us tap more into empathy. And so I feel like once we can redistribute the opportunities for more technology to come in from other creators, that is going to change how we see each other. Right now, I feel like our empathy is limited to the westernized world. And that's a big piece of it, is our empathy is controlled by who has the means to control the message. So that's, yeah.
Chris?
I mean, I for sure agree with Jean, and as part of my work as well, to sort of try to find a common language, and in the end, it's sort of, for me, it's the shape language and structural composition, and for many early presentations as well, it was thinking, sort of being confronted by people saying, oh, but what about other cultures, outside of your own, outside kind of European culture? And so it's allowed me to investigate even deeper into this common aesthetic language, that we can all identify with, body tension, shape language, the tactile properties of these things. And as yeah, these tools become more well known, and sort of the accessibility to game development platforms, which is also opening up. You know, we have the Unreal game engine, Unity game engine, which anyone with a computer, so there's also sort of still a limiting, so there's an entry barrier there, of course, for anyone who has access to one. But this ability to author a game and have it played by people around the world is very empowering, and it's sort of as Jean mentioned, you know, we can start to hopefully see more and more diverse voices appearing in games. But at the moment, again, this kind of objective-driven experience, this clickbait-driven experience, doesn't consider the kinesthetics of it. So what is the meaningful artistic value of interacting with a digital device? And that's something that I really like to promote, that there's so much more that we can do that will, again, stretch the definition of game design beyond what has come before, but and interaction design, sorry, to maybe make it more broad. But every medium in a way has seen these kind of awkward baby steps, and we can look to comics, early animation, where they were also focused on very specific experiences. So in comics, it was the superhero; in animation, it was the slapstick gag. And it was only until these mediums reached their golden age, which was characterized by a connection with the artistic heritage that was waiting to be discovered, this lineage. And we when we look at games and interaction design, there's so, you know, they're around us and they're pervasive. You know, games are sort of valued more than music and film combined. They're huge industries, but they're still young. You know, it's hard to see them that way because they're so Hollywood, so big business, but they're still young, and in 5 or 10 years, they're going to look very different, I think, and we're going to see a maturity arrive in this true golden age. This is not the golden age. The golden age is yet to come.
It's almost like they're that crossroads between the music and the film and the future, and I go back to a statement earlier that it's very interesting that a lot of the gaming has ended up in the workplace. So a lot of the techniques, the technology has evolved into the workplace. A question for both of you. It often puzzles me that most of the games are quite dark. It's very, very unusual for you to find an ultra positive game. There's usually a deep, dark villain, and we get rescued by a superhero, hopefully, and Earth survives, and planet Earth is all wonderful at the end of the day. Why do we need to start in that darkness? What's the correlation between that dystopic or dystopian future that is often pervade in games at the beginning until the superhero comes in and rescues everyone and, you know, opens up into a utopian future? But what is it that puts us in there? If we can relate that to empathy, what places us in that spot? Like, open to whoever wants to take that one first.
I just want to jump in there and say to give people who are watching a little bit of a background. So games can be played on your computer, on your console, on your mobile phone, and each of the way that we interact with games on those platforms has different audiences, has different genres of games. One of the toxic conversations that happens is that on mobile phones, 56% of players on mobile phones are women. And mobile phones drive, I think they said something like, was it 47% of all revenues? But it keeps, like, we're almost at that tipping point where mobile game revenues has outspent everything else. And so the kinds of games that we experience on those platforms differ. The kinds of games that are geared towards women are different. Those games don't tend to be dark. Those games, we have this whole, there's a whole segment of games called wholesome games. There are communities dedicated to wholesome games. That's the space that I want to live in, because I don't want to necessarily, listen, we're living in the middle of a pepperoni pancake pandemic. I don't want to play dark stuff. I want to play Animal Crossing like things that have joy and connection and growth and nurturing. And so it's super interesting so when you said that, I was like, what games are you talking about? But I get it. There are.
I'm one of those mobile users, and I play brain games. I battle myself on how do I beat my score on a brain game. So I'm actually one of those. So my question is very interesting then, isn't it? If we dive into the psychic of my empathy, my question is quite.
There is a charming game that is coming out by a studio in Melbourne, also friends of Chris and I. Like, the games industry is a little bit on the small side and not at the same time. And it's called, I believe it's called A Kinder World. Is that right, Chris? And it's about growing plants. And it's a Melbourne studio. It's women led, and it's all about you go in and you water your plants and you send gratitude to other players. So when we're talking about this whole empathy piece and where we're driving this medium to, I love the fact, and it energizes me, that as we open up and create access to capital for people who are not telling the same stories over and over again, what we're seeing is more humanity. When we invite people in and create opportunities for them to be funded, to have opportunities to design, we are seeing amazing stories coming from the LGBT community, from people from all countries of the world, all cultures of the world. Every facet is showing that we have greater capacity for empathy. So when I see all the money concentrated in the clickbait type games, the Call of Duties, the Activisions of the world who make interesting choices that I disagree with, that's the dark stuff. And there is an appetite for it. And as long as there's an appetite for it, they're still going to make those games. But I love that that Animal Crossing was the #1 game of 2020, that in the pain of the pandemic, we all flocked to something that was wholesome and connected and joyful. Yeah.
I love it. Chris?
Cool. And so to sort of maybe answer your question in some way, where does that kind of stigma come from in the first place? And I think it's going back to these white, males, speaking as a white male, unfortunately. So in some sense, this is where the industry started, and games being sort of built on the backs of athletic sports, competitive sports. It's sort of like a fantasy that sort of such players like to love to indulge in. And the problem has been in some parts sort of answered by Jean, where there is a huge market for it. There's the people sitting in front of computers and personal computers were white males, and sort of, so it's very profitable, and it will continue to be this way for a long time. But the important thing is that we're in the universities, we're starting to see in academia sort of investigation of new mechanisms. How do we generate different physical experiences? How do you tell different stories? And these are not going to come from these big, you would say, AAA studios. They're going to come from these indie studios, these small studios, the university graduates who have had the opportunity to indulge, sort of to explore sort of things that are unusual or different, and tell it a different story. And so we are already seeing, I mentioned the golden ages has yet to come, but there are already signs that it's starting to appear with games. For me, one that even goes back to 2012 is Journey, a game by studio, That Game Company in Los Angeles. And it's a game where it is a multiplayer game, but you don't have the opportunity to talk to anyone like you would, using a microphone in a normal multiplayer game. The experience is somewhat anonymous, and you can only chirp to them using sounds that almost sound like sea creatures chirping at each other. And you go on this journey in this feeling of sublime in a very massive environment. and the objective, where usually would be conflict or beating someone, being better than someone, the objective here is just to feel empathy towards them, to feel a connection to someone that you'll never know their real name. It's just you spent some time traveling through this sublime environment together, and that's it. And some people say, but that's not a game. Where is the conflict? Where is the challenge? But this is what's exciting about this. That games are changing. There's some wonderful, the beginner's guide, as well as something, I sometimes even find myself thinking, I've just played this game, but it's more than a game. This is, I kind of reference all the most wonderful, meaningful films and musical experience I've ever experienced. But the beginner's guide, I play it and I think, wow, that's gives me the feels. It's on such a deep level. So I won't say what it's about, but it's the good thing about these games are also that they're short. Games like Journey, the beginner's guide, you can finish in 2 hours, which is also something that distinguishes these Call of Duties, which can take 30 hours or 100 hours to complete. And so this is also something that I promote, short games, which I realize I'm talking for a long time, but which these short games are also supportive of difficult topics. When you are playing a game about post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe 100 hours is a bit too long to be immersed in such a difficult topic. This is more better suited for these competitive sports-like games, whereas something which is very meaningful, I think, is better structured in a short experience. Sort of something that you can experience from start to finish, because many games aren't even finished. I think there's like something over 60% of games aren't completed because they're so long generally. So shorter games are also a good direction.
There's
And I think it's super, sorry to interrupt, but I think there's when I give my talk on ethical narrative design principles, I always start with the root of like, what does the word game mean? And the word game is derived from a German word, and I believe it's Gamen. I'm probably butchering that, and this idea that there are some people who have very strong feelings about what is a video game. Like they're very like, video game must have combat, must have conflict. I'm like, okay, what if games were nurturing? What if games are, just an interactive experience? So even the word game is a loaded thing in our industry because people have feelings about it. It can't be easy. It can't be accessible. Like there's some really bizarre conversations, mostly by people who they feel like they have a strong need to gatekeep the experience of interactive media. And I don't know, I think they just need to go play some more Animal Crossing and make some real life friends.
I love that. I love that. There's a
Yeah.
couple of comments coming in about what kind of games people are playing. So history driven, some traditional violent action, artistic, indie. So there's quite a variety in the people that are listening on the webinar side of it at the moment. So Jean, you've told us some of your favorite games. Chris, what are your favorite games?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's the journey, the beginner's guides, and maybe the beginner's guide is sort of worth unwrapping a little more. It's by a designer called Davey Radin, and the first game that he was sort of became famous for in a way is called the Stanley Parable. And both games, the beginner's guide and Stanley Parable, are wonderful because they explore the very definition of games, or like what is the meaning of, how do games communicate to us, what do they make us do, these objectives. And the Stanley Parable is wonderful because it's a first person experience without any combat. You're just walking around with a narrator telling you what to do. And this is like the basic principle that many games follow, where say do this, shoot that, collect this. But what's funny about the Stanley Parable is that the designer has recorded multiple alternative actions based on anticipating what you might do in in defiance of what the game is telling you to do. So it starts off at the beginning by you get up out of your desk. You've been happily typing away, doing what the computer tells you. This is what the narrator is also voicing. And then it says, and then Stanley walked, realized that there was no one in the office or something. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. And then he reached a room with 2 doors, and I can't remember it. And he went through the left door. And usually in games, the experience is so structured that there is maybe only 1 door to go through. It's a very linear experience. But suddenly you're presented with 2 doors, and this narrator that is in some way challenging you not to do what you're being told. And the minute you go through the wrong door, there's a voice and a response from the narrator saying, even though Stanley was meant to go through the left door, and usually he went through the right one, and then it's a whole sequence of alternatives, and you can stand in a cupboard, and the narrator says, comments on that. And it's just, so the work of David Radin is wonderful in so many ways, because it sort of laughs, and critiques, what it is to play games, what it is to design games, and how do they affect us emotionally. So. Oh, have you muted? So Christina, so yes, yeah.
Okay, so my spacebar unmute is not working. Do you have any other games, Jean? So I know that you both mentioned a couple of the same ones, but any others?
Yes, I have been recently asked to play a number of games for review. So I got into Spiritfarer. I noticed that was mentioned in the chat, and that was super interesting to explore the other world, the experience of death. Earlier, I think last year, I got into playing Gris, which is also exploring loss, which was particularly emotional because I just lost my father about 1.5 years ago. So I was very hesitant to play it when it first came out. And I thought, well, how is that going to tap into my real life experience and my real life emotions around grieving? And it's just, I love that we can experience short games that play with our emotions. They are meant to tap into our sense of empathy and curiosity and play, even while exploring dark and sensitive matter. It's not like you're going to run out and say, I want to play a game about grieving, but in playing through Gris, to me, Gris was my favorite of the two, like between Spiritfarer and Gris. I really loved Gris, and I think it was just like the aesthetic and the experience of it. And I also played a really darling Canadian game that was just nominated for a Canadian Screen Award this week. So I'm very happy for them. And it's called Love. And it was this very clever puzzle game, very small in scope, but very clever mechanics where you're constantly turning this building around to figure out where in history, where in the timeline have things happened to these characters. There's no words, but the narrative that they told was so powerful. And I was like, damn, this is great stuff. So I love that people are having fun with the use of game mechanics, and that narrative isn't always about words, so that you can really reach that deep sense of empathy just through visual and engagement and user design.
Mm-hmm. And I can maybe add one more if that's okay, because I sort of recalled that a game that I've been playing quite frequently is one of these big budget games based on the Lego Movie 2. So it's not so much about some kind of meaningful or sort of like some niche, I'm using the wrong words. It's not about love or any sort of traumatic experiences. But what I especially like about it is that I can play with my 4-year-old son. It's a game where everything is playfully, even the combat is sort of playfully done in a kind of this Lego style. We can play collaboratively, him sitting next to me on the sofa. We can also be the same character at the same time, which means that I can play the game and do the difficult puzzles, whereas he can just enjoy being in the universe, changing his character, building vehicles and flying around and saying, look, daddy, you know, and sort of like there's this kind of asymmetrical sort of ability, you know, for, you know, what I can do, what he can do, but it doesn't matter. We can exist and be together in this wonderful, colorful, funny, playful virtual space. And so I think there's a huge niche so for these kind of games where 4-year-olds can play comfortably without feeling awkward, like with all these button combinations, you know, compared to Call of Duty or For Honor. You know, there's like 15 different buttons you have to memorize, and it's kind of hard to even sometimes motivate yourself after, if you've taken a break, to think, oh, I have to relearn all of that. You know, I'm going to be useless in the first half an hour. And to play games like Lego Movie 2, which is really unique. And now we've moved on to Lego City Undercover, which also has this ability where we can be the same character at the same time, because it's important to highlight that many Lego games, you have to be a different character or switch characters. And the minute that happens, you know, I have to take the controller from him to do the difficult stuff that his character can, the actions that he can do. And so it's just that's a really wonderful thing for us to connect around games, you know, sort of our shared introduction to the medium.
We're almost talking about how games are heightening, or we are talking about how games are heightening empathy between players. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. First question is from Hector. What is the role of creators around moderating the communities around their games? Should the communities become whatever they want to be? Should creators take an active role and a stance regarding social issues, etc.? What are your thoughts? Jean, I'll throw to you first.
Thank you, Hector. There, you know, you just have to spend enough time on games Twitter to see the conversation around politics don't belong in games and politics don't belong in art. Politics have existed in art since the first cave paintings were done. And you know, a creator can come out and say, well, I created something and I didn't intend for it to have a political meaning, and I completely absolve myself of how the community experiences that and how the community galvanizes the message. I don't know, Christina, how much time you spend in understanding what's happening in the video game world, but there's a game that just came out or is about to come out. I think it's called 6 Days in Fallujah. And it's caused a whirlwind of empathy, deep storm. And it is, I don't know the development team, and maybe Chris has been following this a little bit more closely. It is the glorification of war in Iraq that results in basically you get to go and kill Iraqi citizens. Like that's their idea of this game. And it's like an epic budget, and it's ridiculous, it's offensive. And for these people who are developers going, well, it's just a game. It's not just a game. So to answer your question, Hector, I absolutely do think that we have an ethical responsibility to create morally responsible games, to instruct our community. You don't have to play it a certain way. You don't have to experience a game a certain way, but you do have to be kind and respectful to the other people who are part of this community. Like it's our duty as creators to set those boundaries of kindness and compassion and empathy. And maybe that's just my perspective on things, but I feel like everybody is so driven towards clickbait and profiteering that I don't want to see profiteering out of games and creativity that are driven by the big bang, the wow thing, without thinking about the human cost.
Love that. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, Jean put it wonderfully. So I'm not sure I can add too much more other than maybe, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that the game design platforms are now free, you know, for anyone with access to a PC to develop their own games, and publishing platforms are, of course, international, sort of the Steam platform, the Apple Store, and it's very naive if, as Jean said, sort of you think that, you know, it's not your business how others receive it. You know, by the click of a button, games can be played around the world. And, you know, so it doesn't matter if you're a small indie studio or a very well-financed, big budget studio, where you have even more responsibility to really ask and research, have players test your games, and maybe even employ cultural experts, who can sort of maybe give you advice on, well, you've included this culture in here, how are they going to receive it? You've represented them in this particular way. And so it's very important, again, as part of the maturing process of the industry, is to realize that, again, that we are games, which is carefree and lacks responsibility, but and at the same time it doesn't. The definition is being stretched to its limits at this point. And I participated in a conference once with an academic from UCLA in Los Angeles, Ido Stun, and the topic was games, the definition of games, and he said, rather than change the name, rather than call it something else, just wait. Just wait, and people will slowly start to understand that video games are something more than what we see them as at the moment, and they are more. That we need to be more responsible and careful of the messages that we sometimes subconsciously present.
Thank you. And Tyler actually made a comment that wouldn't it be good to have some kind of Hippocratic oath for artists that are developing these games. And Tyler, we'll get back to your question in a minute. I'm going to William's question. William says, on the opinion on the definition being the difference between game and interactive experience is having a loose condition way to fail in some way. So I'm not or without using those words to label them, is that an important distinction? So I'm taking from that the distinction between the game, the word game, and the word interactive experience. Jean, in your interactive experience?
I don't know.
I can help out if you want, Jean.
Yeah, you know what? I was gonna say, like, for me, when I go to play a game, I don't play a game because I'm looking for a win-lose scenario. I'm looking to experience something in a different medium that isn't music, film, or television. And I appreciate that there is the kinds of games that really annoy me are games that have zero player agency, and I'm literally being told, click here, click here, click here, which, I'm sorry to be cruel about Spiritfarer, that's how I felt about it, and it really annoyed me, and I didn't feel I could explore the world. But it doesn't have to be about a win or lose. Like, why are we so binary? Why are we so binary in the way that we consume our world? Life is not a 0 and a 1. It is just, it's full of gradients in there. Chris, please take over. I feel like I'm going to be all like, about it.
All right. But well, my approach would be to highlight that there's theoretically this distinction between formal games and informal games, and you can have semi-formal games. So formal games are defined as games that do have these objective-driven experiences that you have to learn special skills, like in chess, to defeat an opponent. Informal experiences are the equivalent of playing in a sandpit. There is no one telling you what to do, and there's no objective other than the one that you define for yourself. And it doesn't even have to be a challenging objective. So this is why it's difficult to sometimes visualize, video games as encapsulating both of these polar opposites, how we define games. And so that's why interactive art, you could say, is kind of more appropriate in a way. But as I like the idea of what Ido Stan said that I sort of mentioned earlier, is just to wait and sort of like slowly people will forget what games, in a way had to be for some people, defined as, and it will sort of be expanded to encapsulate these informal experiences as well.
I would love to add to that as well. So my husband and I, we started up our own company. We built a technology. We wanted to empower authors who did not know how to code to make point and click adventure games. So basically that they could adapt their short stories and novels into games. The way that players engage with story in our game is different than most other games. It is, and I remember as I was going out there into the world and talking to people about our concept and trying to get them bought into it, when I said video games, the face of judgment, right? They go to immediately when you say video games, they'll think two things. Video games are for children. By the way, the average age of a gamer is like 37. The average age of a female gamer is 42, so I'm finally above average. Or they'll think about that angry, pimply, pizza-eating teenage angry boy in his basement who might grow up to commit horrible crimes if you watch anything on the American television. And so like that has become how we perceive of games. But the proliferation of games, if you have a smartphone, chances are you've played a game, right? But how we gatekeep that word, how we gatekeep the concept of what is a game, what is art, what are win conditions, all of those things. We need to be working at continually expanding our definition of this medium rather than letting the people with the loudest voices speak over us and say, this is the way that these are games. This is the definition of game.
That leads beautifully into the question from Tyler. Even if unintentionally, social media found a way to gamify and promote controversy with trending metrics. Have you seen any systems or ideas that show promise for doing the same with empathy?
So maybe could you ask that question again? I have to,
So
I think,
even
reflect on it a bit more.
And I think you've both been talking about it really anyway. Even if unintentionally, social media found a way to gamify and promote controversy with trending metrics. Have you seen any systems or ideas that show promise for doing the same with empathy?
Well, I had pointed to Kinder World, which is that Melbourne-based company that's building this, and this idea of tend and befriend games. It's super interesting. So there's a company based out of Toronto called True Love, and what they're doing is super interesting. And when you go talk to their founder, it's a tend and befriend gamified experience, but she doesn't want to call it video games. She doesn't want to live in that space. And what she sees as this is an interactive digital experience that exists within the health field because it's tapping into mental health and self-care and awareness. And so we're having to change our language to be validated in the idea that empathy can only exist outside of games. So we're starting to see that. And what I do love though, and I think Chris tapped on this earlier, is that in the university settings, we are seeing more and more spaces open up for us to have deeper, more meaningful conversations, more critical conversations about ethical design, responsible design, serious subject matter, and those things are starting to open up. So that whole conversation of empathy is just getting deeper and deeper, and that is the only reason that I've stayed in this industry, because I'm not interested in in anything other than exploring empathy.
And I think that's also a good point that I think the games industry, as toxic as it can be, maybe that toxicity is also a motivator for these discussions. And I sometimes feel that the games industry is very progressive, at least in terms of the discussions happening as a result of the toxic stuff that goes on online in sort of gaming chat rooms. And so the gender pronouns, sort of identity and things like that are commonplace on game design courses, where, especially in America, and we started doing this here in Zurich as well at the SA Institute where I teach here, sort of asking, so at least saying that, please respect people's gender pronouns or be conscious of it, use a people first language. And it's not stuff that you see on a chemistry course or sort of a conventional course. And it's because we live in this sometimes very toxic industry, or play and interact, that these questions are being raised, and we're becoming very conscious of each other and these topics. So I think that's something that we can be proud of as an industry, if we ignore the motivator for those discussions for one moment.
It's interesting that this comes up because we're also talking about gamification in a lot of areas as well. And we've just started using tacos as incentives to have a bit of fun on our communication channel, Slack. And the giggles that it's creating are quite surprising, and that empathy that is being shown. So maybe, Chris, it is the fact that games are now, because we're having those conversations, and Jean, I think you alluded to this before as well, because we're having the conversations and because we're noticing that there are so many good games coming out, and games that allow us to have those positive feelings and develop those feelings of empathy, that it can be a great thing for humanity. We're almost out of time. I'd like to get a final comment on your views on the industry, where you would like to see it go, where you think it's going, and maybe even the best experiences that you've had in using technology for empathy before we leave. There's a few other questions, but I'd love to get that final comment. Maybe we need to schedule another discussion. I think we could go much deeper, but who'd like to go first?
Jean, you're welcome to go. I mean, I can do too.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so well, for me, I mean, it's the why I wrote the interactive empathy and embodiment frame method, which is my latest book. It's to demonstrate that we can reimagine a games industry where empathy is the driving principle. What sensory experience do we want to evoke, rather than what challenge do we want to present to the player? And so this is what I want to see. It's like to give people the tools to affect people and give them sort of very different, aesthetically varied, unique voices in the games industry. And I think the beginner's guide sort of is something that I always come back to as a game, that explores depression, and loneliness in an incredibly powerful way. And so it's sort of to evoke this ability to archive bodily experiences, as I demonstrated with the signature drawing, copying exercise. And I think that's what I really would like to focus on. How games can physically change you, and by physically changing you, change your emotions as well, affect your emotions.
Well, it's super interesting because the approach that I've taken, I mean, Chris and I have been mutual friends for a couple of years now. And for me, as an unapologetic socialist, I honestly think that the way that we're going to change this industry is by changing who has access to resources. It's why we built our technology. When we democratize storytelling in games, we create opportunities, we lower barriers to entry. That means that we have more diverse voices coming in, which means we have access to understanding, deeper empathy. So for me, it's about the resources. Like, change who has control of the resources means that we can change our experiences as a whole. And it's so strange, because in the last 2 years, I've been doing a lot of career coach and leadership coaching in the game space. And my primary focus is serving people who would be considered traditionally marginalized in the industry, and being able to champion them and move them into positions where they have more access to resources. That's how I'm driving the empathy piece in the world, is hopefully giving people the opportunities to have greater voice so that they can impact people. And, if people are interested in changing the world, we need to put money in the hands of people who are creating the stories that will change the world. Likes and platitudes don't pay rent. And, meaningful change comes from meaningful art, and we have to feed our artists.
More than ever, we need to feed our artists. I think that's the perfect line to go out on. Chris Salarski and Jean Leggett, I have had the most amazing time with you both this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here and talking about the whole gaming industry and how we can become more empathetic. Chris, could you just tell us the name of that book again, please, of your book?
Oh, it's Interactive Empathy and Embodiment.
Yes, and we put the link in the chat for anybody that wants to see it, and we'll also put it on the Facebook Live page. So thank you. Jean, do you have any resources that people can go to?
They are welcome to check out my podcast, which is called Games, Grit, and Gratitude, Real Talk with Jean Leggett. And I really try to take an approach of empathy and compassion and respect and merge life coaching with game design, because I think it's important that we don't see games creators as disembodied from their work. We are living, breathing human beings that have valid experiences, and often those life experiences shape how we show up in the world. So g3realtalk.com is how you can find the podcast.
Thank you so much. And you know, the other thing that we can do is vote with our wallets. So if you're going to purchase a game, make sure it, or not make sure, that's very judgmental. I would love it to encourage you, along hopefully with Jean and Chris, to purchase something that is extremely creative and wonderful and will benefit humanity. Once again, Chris and Jean, thank you so much for your time. I would really love to have you back on another podcast in a couple of months' time. So I'm just going to try my luck there. Thank you, everyone.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week in our A Future by Design Salon series. It is Thursday before Good Friday. If you're listening to us live, have a very safe holiday season. Have a happy Easter if that is your religious belief. If not, stay safe, everybody. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you back on one of our programs again. Tomorrow morning, we are actually going to do a conversation around technologies of the future with the wonderful Lisa Andrews. So take care. See you soon.
Cheers.